right, well, we are a minute after 1, and I think we'll still have folks joining in, but we've got about 30 people on the call now. This is great. So what I like to do is set my view to speaker, so you'll be able to see the screen and you'll be able to see who's speaking. You know how to set your controls to speaker mode. I'll go ahead and start. So welcome everyone to Preservation Connecticut's Talking About Preservation. We're really excited this week to be talking about Desegregate Connecticut and should preservation support zoning reform. I think this is a really important topic and we're really excited to have Sara Bronin with us this afternoon to chat with us. So those of you that are new to Preservation Connecticut, we have a really great staff here. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director, not speaking for myself, but for the rest of the staff. Chris Wiegren, Deputy Director, is on the phone call today. Renee Trubert, our Preservation Services and Making Places Manager, also on the call today. Jordan Sorensen does our development and special projects is with us. Kristen Hopewood, our Director Development Assistant. And we have 3 circuit riders, Mike Farino, Brad Scheid, and Stacy Vero. And the circuit riders are our folks that are the boots on the ground that will come out into your community and meet with you, meet with municipalities, developers, homeowners, anyone who's a steward of a historic property and has questions about maintenance or questions about preservation planning or any issues that you're working on in your community and will help with community organizing and any specifics about preservation issues. So our staff is always ready and available to work with you all. So Preservation Connecticut is the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. We were established in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly. And our mission is to protect, promote, and preserve the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut communities. And one of our great programs that we like to do is educational and being able to connect with the folks in the community, everyone who's doing preservation work at the community level, and to provide public programs and offer up forums for discussion of preservation issues such as the Desegregate Connecticut issue today. So we're really glad to have so many folks joining in. We'd like you to use the chat feature to send questions to me directly. And we're really looking forward to answering your questions and sharing information with you about this program. So you can send the questions in the chat or you can also email them to me as well. And anything that we don't get to today, feel free to email to me as well, jmontanaro@preservationconnecticut.org. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Sara Bronin, our guest speaker today, you can share your screen if you'd like to, Sara, and we'll let you take it from here. Sara is on the Board of Trustees of Preservation Connecticut and our immediate past chair of Preservation Connecticut. So thank you, Sara, for being with us.
Thank you so much, Jane. It's an honor to be among preservationists, as always. As Jane said, I've been lucky enough to be on the board of Preservation Connecticut since 2007, with a couple of years when we were in DC. I am definitely a preservationist. I serve on the National Trust Advisory Board and Advisory Council, or I'm a National Trust Advisor. I don't know what they call us really. And I'm also the author of a couple of books on historic preservation law, which I teach at UConn Law School. So I come to you in my other hat. The other thing that I teach is land use and zoning, and I write about those topics as well. But I come to them from the perspective of a preservationist. I feel free to, Jane, interrupt me if there are any pressing questions, but I'm going to go through about 20 minutes of of discussion about what we're trying to do with this new movement that you may have heard about. And I'm so glad you're here to listen about today, and then take questions as you see fit. So who we are. So over the summer, we started having conversations, and by we, I mean groups of planners and architects and preservationists and lawyers about the things that we had been seeing in the news. So everything from the George Floyd's murder to the many things that came before it and followed that, and thinking about the way our land use laws and many other laws actually embed segregation, embed racism in ways that most of us probably hope isn't true, but unfortunately has that impact. One of the areas of law which has the greatest impact on housing patterns and segregation is zoning. So our group started to focus in on zoning as an area of law that we think has had negative impacts and could be in some modest ways reformed. As we started talking, more and more people started to join the conversation, and these are all the people in our, I guess you could say, coalition. We're all working together to define statewide zoning reforms that could make our local zoning efforts a little bit more equitable and also achieve other goals like the ones I'll talk about in a moment. But if you look at this coalition, it includes not only the statewide AIA, which some of you are members of, I know, the American Planning Association, of course, social justice organizations, and Preservation Connecticut has been a continuing part of the conversation, as well as Preservation Action in the Connecticut Main Street Center all together. So looking at this broad group, it really gives you a sense that many different entities are trying to do the right thing and find solutions to this really long-standing issue of how zoning treats housing. And this is related to preservation in ways I'll talk about in just a moment. The three things that our movement has really tried to focus on are the ways that zoning can help promote equity, economic development, inclusive growth, really, and environment. So you probably have seen, starting from the summer and again continuing forward and backward as well, but really a heightened heightened awareness of racial tension and that segregation. So this is something you've seen maybe in news reports, you've seen in public officials' remarks, and that you've probably taken note of yourself. How does that come into play in a land use context? So today, later this afternoon, we are releasing what's called a zoning atlas, and we have mapped in this atlas 2,618 zoning districts and 2 subdivision jurisdictions in the state. These 2 images that I'm going to show you from the atlas illustrate the extent of the equity issue when it comes to zoning. So local zoning laws allow everywhere in purple single-family housing. That land constitutes 90.6% of land in the state. Now, if anybody would like to guess in their minds how much land is allowed for 4+ family housing as of right, and it is 2.0% of the state where 4 family housing or more is allowed pursuant to the terms of the zoning regulations, as opposed to having to go through a public hearing. So you can see the difference between 90.6% and 2% to highlight the kinds of opportunities that are available to people who may not prefer to live in detached single family housing or may not be able to afford to live in detached single family housing. If you look at the concentrations of purples, you'll see they're in Hartford, New Haven, New Britain, Montville, a few other places. So I encourage you to check out the zoning atlas and overlay it onto your own communities. Again, the 169 towns are shown. What we found is really, you can highlight different variables within the zoning atlas. We looked at 32,000 pages of zoning regulations to come up with the atlas, and we mapped in that atlas where all kinds of different housing is allowed. So again, a very interesting tool. And just as a highlight, for you in the Hartford region, this map on the right shows in the purple of different shades of purple. It's all the same for this purpose. One family housing without a public hearing, two family housing with a public hearing, three family housing with a public hearing. So this is even the more permissive or the more expansive image of where three family housing is allowed. And then finally, four family housing where it's allowed with a public hearing. A lot of what's around Hartford would be gray if it weren't for our including public hearings in this group. All right, so equity, it's now very clear on our maps how our zoning codes treat different people. And New Haven County, Fairfield County are some of the most segregated areas in the whole country. If you're on our mailing list, you received this morning, you should have received this morning, a write-up about that issue, because we have had people say, oh, Connecticut's not really that segregated. Well, there's lots of studies that show that we unfortunately are. We also know that zoning reform has economic impacts. So we know that zoning reform can help to create new, different kinds of housing. It can attract new people to Connecticut. It can help support local Main Street businesses if it's directed towards those areas. And it can also help us make sure that we are developing the land that should be developed and not developing outward into our farmlands and forest. As you know, preservation is itself a revenue generating activity, and lots of us work to create housing within historic places, generating additional activity in wherever, whether in historic buildings or otherwise, converting units to multifamily housing or creating new multifamily housing would generate significant revenue for local governments and income and jobs. New development and new housing would also help to create, and by new here, we mean new conversions as well as new developments, but that can also help to raise the value of surrounding homes. There have been numerous studies showing a tie between diverse housing types and how they actually positively impact single family housing, in addition to enabling property owners to increase their home's value through things like accessory dwelling units, which we'll talk about in just a moment. There are environmental reasons too for zoning reform. Right now, our main mode of creating housing is to push housing outward and into sprawl, to create, in some cases, 4+ acre lots for new housing. Instead of putting housing further and further outward, a better approach for Connecticut would be to concentrate development where it already exists, to reduce sprawl, to create more efficiencies of location, and also to create more efficiencies in terms of energy use, because we all know how detached housing out in the middle of nowhere is a lot less efficient than multifamily, even two-family housing, where people are sharing walls and development is more compact. Now, our proposals. So we have a broad range of proposals, and I think I should say first that our proposals take what is essentially a building preservation and land preservation and existing infrastructure approach. And what we're trying to do with our proposals is say, from a statewide level, our policies we should set priorities so that local towns can choose how to address those priorities, but we'll have to address those priorities as part of our statewide goals. We think within our priorities, we should have 3 different overall or sub goals, I guess. Housing diversity, which is to create different kinds of housing, because given the need, we know that Connecticut is really creating housing only for one type of, or a couple of types of people. Families who have reasonable incomes, and to families with means in single family detached housing, and also older people who are more established than let's say the millennials. So housing diversity, housing supply, we aren't producing new housing fast enough. So we all know how many of our historic resources are going to waste in many cases because of financing and environmental remediation and other issues, but in some cases because zoning does not allow for the kinds of rehabilitation that we need for those places to become rehabbed in the way actually that probably they might have been 100 years ago when they were built. And then finally, improving the process. So we've seen across the board that there's very inconsistent decision-making across or even within jurisdictions. So these are the 3 sub-goals that we have in thinking about statewide reform. So I'm going to briefly talk about some specific proposals so we can get to Q&A. One of our specific proposals, and this is especially relevant for old houses, is to enable property owners of single family homes to help to carve out a piece of their housing to serve as an accessory dwelling. Now, some of us, including myself, have a unit of housing within our historic home that is smaller than the main unit. There are lots of people with carriage houses and with large houses all across the state who may not be able to keep them up, who would be able to keep them up and invest in them better if they had some income coming in from a small rental unit within their house. If we say to towns, okay, you have to legalize accessory dwelling units, we're also saying in our legislation that they should have the ability to set out architectural standards, to require owner occupancy, even though it's not something that is great for affordability for everybody. It is something that we've seen in towns across the state. And we think, and we've talked with a lot of towns, and they said, well, that we would love to legalize, but let's stick with the owner occupancy. So we've included that. And then to prohibit short-term rentals, especially up and down the shoreline, there's a concern that ADUs will be used as short-term rentals. So we've said, okay, towns, you can limit that use of an ADU. Now, but by enabling them, we hope to help homeowners reinvest in housing that already exists. And again, that includes a lot of older housing. Second proposal that I wanted to mention today is a transit-oriented development proposal. This may or may not relate specifically to historic buildings, although of course lots of our train station locations were the locations of historic train stations as well. We do see around those train stations a lot of development that is undesirable, really, when it comes to thinking about the economic potential for those areas as well as their potential for housing. So what we've said is that within a half-mile radius of each of these transit stations across the state, and here are the towns that would be affected by that, 50% of the area within the half-mile radius would have to be rezoned for housing, and the town would choose which 50%, and the town would choose what kind of housing, but we're suggesting a minimum of 4 units of housing. It's a pretty modest ask of these towns, but if you look closely, some towns, including Greenwich and Madison, have almost or virtually satisfied our goals under this legislation. But many other towns are zoning around train stations for large lot, 2-acre housing. And again, that's not something that makes sense for that development. Just 2 weeks ago, the state of Massachusetts adopted unanimously and with Republican and near unanimously with the Republican governor's support, a bill that was very similar to ours regarding a half-mile around transit. And so we think this is very much in line with what's happening nationally. If the town chooses to allow more than 10 units, we would say 10% should be affordable, and we're excluding from that radius sensitive lands. Third proposal, and again, these have been developed in consultation with a wide variety of groups, including the leaders from the preservation organization statewide. But this one is really important, and we call it Main Street Middle Housing. Around our main streets, including in Stonington here in Water Street, which does zone for housing around its main street, which probably explains why it's so lively and vibrant. We think that around main streets, and particularly historic main streets, there's an opportunity to zone in a way that puts feet on the street and that makes those historic places more sustainable and more viable from an economic perspective, but also from an I guess, a global perspective, environmental and otherwise. Our thought is that if towns can select a corridor between 1/4 mile and 3/4 of a mile and zone that corridor within a 5-minute walking distance, so 1/4 mile around that, for 2 to 4 family housing at a minimum, we think that would really help to enliven our main streets. And again, it would concentrate development where it already exists. And by the way, reaffirm the development patterns of yesteryear, because as we all know, 100 years ago, when there was no zoning, there were lots of different uses cheek to jowl in our historic downtowns, and a lot of it included housing above shops. Right now, housing is often prohibited in and around main streets, and we think this is something that has been detrimental to usage of our main streets over time. Now, this would only apply to towns over 7,500 in population with concentrated development. Towns, again, could choose architectural requirements, and we'd be very interested to see the variety that towns go for here. This is something that is extremely important to Main Streets and to preservationists, and it is parking mandates. So if you think about, so what is a parking mandate? So right now, anytime you develop a unit of housing outside of Hartford, and I believe Morris and a couple of other towns that don't require any parking, if you develop in most places in Connecticut, the zoning code will require you to put parking on the same lot as the dwelling unit. Where I live now, I live in a brownstone in downtown Hartford, which has 2 units in it, and it is on a 0.1 acre lot. We have found parking on our neighboring parcel owner's lot. That we have an easement over their property, but we don't have parking on our lot specifically. We have 1 car. If we needed parking, we would know where to find it. And I think the idea for minimum parking is that they add to the cost of housing, they add to the overpavement of our state, and they add to, they restrict the places where somebody could build housing. If we had to, on our 0.1 acre lot, put 4 units of parking on the lot, 4 parking spaces on our lot, we would have to lop off half of our brownstone, which obviously doesn't make sense. But since it was built in 1865, nobody ever thought of parking at the time, and we don't have any parking on our lot. So in any case, parking mandates raise the cost of parking because they constrain what can be built, and they also add to infrastructure costs. We have seen some very wealthy towns that require 3 parking spaces for 1 studio apartment. So you see in this image here, 2 parking spaces and a 2-bedroom apartment. Imagine how outlandish a 3 parking space to studio apartment ratio is. Our proposal is that for housing statewide, we cap parking mandates to 2 per 2-bedroom or 1 for studio and 1-bedroom apartment, and lift minimum parking requirements in both our TOD, transit-oriented development radius, our train station radius essentially, and our Main Street areas. So what we are hoping to do with this is to change the conversation about parking requirements, knowing that people like me will always find a place for their cars. They will rent from a neighboring property owner, they will find a lot, they will put it in a garage. But to dictate that through zoning has been really detrimental. And I'm sure all of us can identify towns and specific buildings that have been raised to put in a parking lot. This is a red alert parking. Okay, I have a lot of red alerts here. This is a really big issue for preservationists. I don't know how many of these I did. Okay, I thought you might find that funny. Okay, I can't hear your voices when I'm on this when I'm on the lecture circuit here, lecturing here. All right, so here's an example of parking replacing housing in a historic neighborhood in New Haven. I don't know if it's officially designated historic, but you can look at that housing and you know it's old. Just a couple of months ago, that zoning requirements made this instead of new housing. Hartford is a victim to parking. We are way overparked. To the left is an image of Hartford. The red is parking in 1957, and to the right is parking in 2009. These are from my colleague at UConn, Norman Garrick. But the amount of space in our cities that we've devoted to cars is unbelievable. Okay, I'll stop talking about parking now, but I just have to get that in there. The other thing that we're proposing, I think this may be the last big topic, 2 last big topics I'm talking about. One is a model form-based code, and we've only heard support for this, that the state develop a model form-based code that is based on, that helps towns to create architectural standards that they can draw from. Now, you know from Chris Wiegren's great book, Connecticut Architecture, which I hope you all have a copy of, and a lot of the Preservation Connecticut's work over the years, that Connecticut does have a lot of unique architecture. On the other hand, a lot of our housing stock shares similarities, architectural similarities. And so it's our thought that if we develop a model form-based code, we can get to this question of the character of communities through clear rules that people who are developing housing can take, and that towns can start approving housing as a right without public hearings, using the code as their security blanket. That finally brings me to this question of character. So you may have heard on this call, oh, you know, there's a conversation at the Capitol about the character of our communities. As a committed preservationist, character, in my mind, can have very positive connotations. But in the minds of many people and in the way that zoning codes have been applied over time to housing, the word character has become to mean something that has racial overtones. And you've heard it perhaps if you've attended meetings. I don't want those kinds of people in my community. They will change the character of my community. So what we're trying to do in our suggestions is to urge legislators to replace character for the words we really mean, which is architectural context and physical site characteristics. We think that will explain what we as preservationists and you know, we as the community of people who cares about equity, what we mean by character. It's not about the people. It's really about the scale and the feel and the physical ambiance of a community, not who's living in it. So if you hear, happy to have a conversation, debate about that. But after a lot of months, this was our best proposal. And by the way, the legislature last year passed out of the Planning and Development Committee almost unanimously a very similar bill that deleted character from the zoning statute. We've also talked about sewerage standards, land use commissioner trainings, and traffic standards, which may be too technical to get into here. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hope for some Q&A. That's it from me.
Great, thank you, Sarah. That's a lot to take in, but I am really, we'll share the slide deck and the recording and everything. And of course, your website is a fantastic resource and full of information that you've been researching. And I'm just so struck by how the goals of Desegregate Connecticut really overlap with a lot of the preservation goals of reusing historic buildings and, you know, taking advantage of density and taking advantage of transit-oriented design and being sensitive to the environment, and just so many ways that I think that supports preservation goals as well. So thank you for sharing that with us. One of the questions that came in before the program was, how does this relate to village district overlays?
Great. It doesn't affect village district overlays. It affects any zoning regulations that are adopted through the zoning statute. And the great thing about most village district overlays is that they articulate character. You know, this, as we've just discussed it, they have architectural standards and site development standards that really get to these issues of scale and form and massing and location on the site and so on. So I think village district standards tend to do a pretty good job of that generally, and this is really focused on zoning standards.
And how do preservationists feel about turning a historic house into 3 apartments?
Is that a question for me as a preservationist, or is that a general question?
I think that's a general question.
Yeah, so our proposals are not about don't affect every single housing unit across the state. With the extent to which our proposals deal with single family housing, for example, is really reflected in the accessory dwelling unit proposal, which would allow people to create 1 unit of housing, a small unit that's 30% of the main unit, or up to 1,000 square feet, whichever is less, in the housing. And the town, again, could allow more than that, and many towns do allow more than that. Some towns allow 50 to 60% of the main unit, but we thought 30% was a pretty fair average of what we've seen in, across towns. So we're not requiring conversions of single family housing to 3-family housing, but at the same time, we have also seen that when communities allow for more different kinds of housing, It does help to protect historic properties because it makes them more economically viable. You don't have a lot of people who will invest in the kind of housing that we see even here in Hartford. An 8,000 square foot single family house that is a historic house has a lot of needs. And again, we're not saying with our proposals that every such huge house must be rezoned in any particular way other than the accessory dwelling unit provision. But what we are saying is hopefully this is a gateway or a leveling of the playing field in a way to try to help towns understand the benefits of housing diversity through very specific proposals that we're starting out with statewide.
And as a very general preservation goal, to see historic properties used adaptively or differently, as long as they're being used and they're, you know, contributing to the neighborhood, the society. I mean, that's what we want to see. We don't want the buildings to be obsolete or neglected. So supportive of reuses of historic buildings for sure.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, Jane?
Hey, Brad. Go ahead.
Oh, so this is great, Sarah. You've hit all my hot button issues that building code issues have always been a huge issue for me. But I noticed on the Main Street, you called it middle housing. As you know, yeah, and the parking, I agree. So let's say we eliminate the parking, and you know the towns do allow residential as of right above. It's still, I think the perception is it's a housing of last resort, and a lot of the communities have Section 8 tenants in there, and so they stereotype across the board thinking that it's only poor people that can live there. So I know that you use the word middle, and I know you're not. I know you're not arguing for rent subsidies, but I think there is a perception that besides cost, I think there is a perception that it is kind of the housing of last resort. I mean, have you heard that, or what?
No, I mean, when we've talked about Main Street, you're talking about the Main Street housing, and by middle we mean 2 to 4 unit housing, or housing that's not 80 unit apartment buildings or single family homes. It's really the middle, and our focus in that particular proposal is 2 to 4 units. What we've found is actually people are really excited to think of the possibilities that might happen if they could live in a community that they can walk to. So if you think about, you know, a retiree living in Guilford, let's say, or New London, you know, you have greater possibilities as an person who's aging when you don't have to drive. And at the same time, for the business community, it's a sort of virtuous cycle where you have more people there, there's more people on the street, you have more business, you can invest in your business, and it creates a cycle of investment that we find has been lacking in some of our Main Street communities. So whatever the perception is now, we, at least from anecdotal conversations and you know, from our conversations, it seems like people are interested and intrigued by the idea and what this will open up. And it may very well be that the reason for that perception is that zoning doesn't allow housing of that kind. So where you do have it, it's been grandfathered in as a non-conforming use over a period of decades, and there's no new housing that can be created. So you have these pockets of individual housing units that are stigmatized because there's no one else there. But imagine if there were more people there and it actually becomes a little jazzy center.
No, I agree. I just wondered how whatever the other perceptions were of it. So
Thanks, Brad, for that question. Charlie Jansen, you have your hand raised. Go ahead, Charlie.
So this is really to Sarah's point and what Brad was just saying with regard to Main Street middle housing. I just have a couple of quick comments. Connecticut's towns and cities are characterized, just like Stonington, in a very organic way with existing, if now abandoned or unused residential spaces above the street level. That's what you mentioned, Sarah. And the bigger question I have is, and this is to Brad, and it's kind of like, if you give the tools, it may happen. And could reuse revitalization of these spaces be helped along, or even perhaps fast-tracked in some sense by relaxation of Connecticut building code requirements, allowing alternative compliance to create residential use, as well as density bonus? And these can be low-income subsidies and enhancement under state policy. And I just make one sort of follow-up comment, and I think it's absolutely marvelous, just personally, that you have the Stonington Main Street, because just down the street from your photograph is one of the most important upper story residences in the United States that's on the National Historic Register. It's the James Merrill house, where as a poet, he lived above the barber shop on Main Street. And there's a turret there and a house, a residence that's being preserved for writers' conferences in perpetuity now by the town of Stonington, as it was left to them. So my parting comment is, I think maybe low income or entry income. And by entry income, I mean youths who want to buy houses and get into the market, and who would completely enjoy being on a main street like that. We have vast amounts of this infrastructure, and it's already built in our towns. You see it whenever you drive through.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Wendy Belmore, you've had your hand raised.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. This was wonderful to hear. I have a couple of questions that relate to the idea that this may be brought to the legislature for some discussion. Is there any discussion about adding monies to structures that would require rehabilitation to meet the criteria? Would be the first question. So would there be rehabilitation monies potentially available to persons who are interested in becoming more friendly for the middle user? And then the second question is, how would this, if it were enacted, how would this impact existing historic district regulations?
Yeah, so the first question, we're focused on zoning reform, because our best argument is this is free to the state to do. There's no cost associated with it other than the model code, which actually the state has been recently spent $2 million on zoning reforms on a program that has resulted in very little, but we can talk about that separately. So there is money for the model code, but that's the only thing that costs the state money. There is already the state historic tax credit. Preservation Connecticut and other groups have long advocated for that to be expanded, opened up to different forms. And I think that is an excellent existing tool that we should all push to expand as preservationists. To your second question about whether historic district regulation is affected, no, this is about zoning and zoning only. And it's in the zoning chapter, and it talks about zoning codes. And it doesn't affect the more aesthetic regulations of the historic district. That said, this model form-based code could help people to address both their the concerns in historic districts and outside of historic districts. It's something that a historic district commission could advise on whether the town should adopt pieces of it in tandem with their own regulations. So the model form-based code could actually be used by historic district commissions to help them create standards for themselves. And again, this would be by choice. It's a model code, but it would be something that it would be costless to the towns in order for them to adopt. So there's a lot of little, maybe I consider that a little idea, maybe it's a big idea, but the idea there, it solves a lot of different problems. And for sure, it could be a tool for historic commissions as well.
Thank you.
Of course.
For that question. I'll take a question from the chat, and then we'll go to Dan, who's had his hand raised. A question from the chat is the current 830G the best way to measure affordability in a town?
So 830G is a statute that does have something to do with zoning, but it is something that it's a 30-year-old rule for those who don't know what it is. It's a 30-year-old rule that requires towns to have 10% of their housing stock to be affordable. So with a city like Hartford, or all of the central cities, really, it's very easy to meet that criteria. For other cities, especially rural areas, it's very difficult to meet that criteria. For the cities that don't have 10% affordable housing, if a developer wants to build affordable housing that satisfies the definitions in the statute, the developer can sue the town. They can take the town to court under 830G to force the town to approve the housing, at least when it comes to zoning. So 830G is a tool for litigation. It is a tool when a developer or a property owner is developing or planning to develop sufficient affordable housing that it would make a lawsuit, which often costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, worth it. And it is a tool that has produced some housing in the state, but is not, it's a litigation-based approach as opposed to let's make good rules approach. So it's an approach where two parties are duking it out in court and spending a ton of money, often for just one development. Whereas what the approach we're seeking is, leave 830G as it is because there's too many people who don't want it to change. The affordable housing advocacy community does not want it to change at all, even though we're proposing a couple of modest changes to it. But instead look at zoning regulations themselves and start the process of again, in a way, helping communities use our suggestions and use our guidelines to update what it is they're doing when it comes to housing. It's totally separate and apart from the 10% mandates, although we think that much of what we're proposing, including the accessory dwelling units, will be naturally occurring affordable housing. And whether after we do what we're proposing for a few years, the 830G and the affordable housing community says, actually, this is working out. We're creating a lot of units of housing this way. Maybe it's time to change the formulas. I don't know. But, for now, we're not proposing anything with 830G, but it takes a very different approach to solving an affordability problem. We're taking a broader rules-based, let's decide in advance approach, based approach to solve a variety of problems, housing affordability being one of them, but also diversity of housing being another.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Dan, you want to go ahead? Unmute yourself.
Sure, thank you. Actually, the last questioner raised the same point I was going to raise on the historic district commissions and their work and whether there's any foreseen possible conflict on the state statutes. And, and while that's been answered, I was particularly interested in it because a lot of what's being proposed here, which makes sense, is to have higher density, if you will, within half mile of Main Street areas. And I think if we look at most of the historic district that are under commissions within the state of Connecticut, I would venture to think certainly most of them probably are centered on the main streets in the various municipalities. So I was just interested if any conflicts or concerns have kind of arisen on possible conflicts between the proposed state statutes and the statutes under which the historic district commissions operate vis-a-vis issuing certificates of appropriateness.
Yeah, so so as you know from the your characterization of historic buildings, they evolve over time. So what historic districting is about the look and feel, the architecture, and the relationship of a site. And almost, with very few exceptions, and of course, let's say conservation easements and preservation easements talk about use, but with very few exceptions, historic preservation law isn't really about use. It's about form. So you can think of these two areas of law as really being distinct in that zoning, it does talk about form, but it primarily focuses on use, whereas historic preservation law focuses more on form. I don't see a conflict because I see old buildings as being able to have many different lives. And that's one of the great things about the quality of the materials that we used to use, which is that they can be repurposed in many different ways. So I actually think that a vibrant mix of uses is not only not in conflict, it's probably preferable and more likely to result in communities that last than what we have now, which is very strict rules on what kinds of things can be located where, which actually it's almost it's an arrogant approach on our part and our regulators' part. And I'm sure, Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission, which I chaired for 7 years, probably has done some things that are overly predictive of human behavior and overly arrogant too. I think we think that we know how things should develop, and we write these very specific and very restrictive rules on it. But the truth is if you look at our historic main streets, most of them that we love most developed before zoning. So now,
I agree with you. I mean, in terms of use, that's not within the purview of an historic district commission as to what a property owner is using that property for. So that's not the question. I think the question is, and a concern that I would put forth is on really new construction or on property within an historic district, which certainly can, we certainly have plenty of new construction within historic districts that are deemed appropriate to the surrounding area. But when you get into the culture, the character issue, that does come up from time to time within the historic district, in that, when you're trying to determine appropriateness, it does take into account the surrounding area or character of the district. Obviously, you can't be abusive on that. It has to be appropriate in terms of architectural exterior and nothing else. So my question is really kind of was more narrow. Do you see any potential conflict on that narrow question of appropriateness to the surrounding area?
I don't think so. And I don't think we see, we haven't heard, I haven't heard, and this is separate from this Desegregate Connecticut conversation, but, over the years, I haven't really heard that historic commissions have had a big, push or desire to have a lot of say over uses, or that applications are getting denied because of the
you could never deny a certificate of appropriateness based on the commission questioning use. If they did, it should be thrown out. It would lose on appeal. It's really outside the purview of an historic district commission to question use or even ask what the use is. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Ed Gerber, go ahead.
Hi. I am really, I guess I'm going to state something that is perhaps not very popular, but I am not in favor of accessory dwelling units. And the reason for this is, Sara, perhaps you know better than anyone there. Most of my life, I lived in a city. I lived in Washington, D.C., a very dense city. We had great zoning, which prohibited accessory dwelling units in many neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that didn't have that protection had conversions into 3 and 4 family units as a matter of right. Sara, you lived in one and I lived in one called Georgetown, and we had what we called R3 zoning, which was single family use for a townhouse. And the reasons for that were pretty easy. Noise. We did not need, and again, in our neighborhood, the person who would rent this basement would be a student, would be 2 students from Georgetown. You know that 2 18-year-old students are not the quietest people, and they're really not what you really want in the neighborhood. Trash, more trash, rodents, big problems with that, again, in cities, not so much in the suburbs. Parking, you say that people don't have cars. Well, these students do have cars, and they don't register them in Washington. They're registered in New Jersey and in Connecticut. Safety, a lack of inspectors. Again, Washington is not a rich city. It doesn't have inspectors to go around and make certain that these apartments are up to code. We've had many situations where fires have started in basements. There's no way out of the basement except one way. So the poor tenant rushes up a flight of stairs that would normally bring him into the main part of the house. Well, that's bolted. The owner doesn't want that person.
So I see where you're going here, and I'm going to ask you this. How do you feel about your life in Westport right now? Do you feel like it's a good life in Westport? I love your house. I think it's beautiful. I want to show you something right now about Westport. So here we are in Westport is here, Norwalk, New Canaan, Wilton, Weston, Fairfield, Easton. Okay, so that's where we are. Now I'm going to start clicking on, so I've clicked on accessory dwelling units. So this is showing you, okay, here's everything. This is showing you in our zoning atlas where accessory dwelling units are. Now I'm going to click on restrictions that some towns have on accessory dwelling units. So you can see Westport, like many other communities, allows accessory dwelling units. Westport, so this is, I just clicked on allows non-family, non-employees. Westport still allows them, and it also allows non-family, non-employees. Let's see if Westport allows renters. Westport is one of the towns that allows renters. Let's see if it restricts ADUs to elderly only. Doesn't. Actually, that knocked out Greenwich in the corner of the map, but you probably didn't notice that. Now let's see if Westport restricts ADUs to the primary structure. Westport is the only community in your area that actually liberally allows accessory dwelling units without all of the restrictions of everywhere else. And yet Westport and your house and your neighborhood has not completely burned to the ground with sewerage and traffic and other concerns. So I offer you that, not to belittle your concerns, which are valid, and especially
the other thing though, let me just mention this. You mentioned increased value to the property that has the accessory dwelling unit. Yes, that's true. The taxes on that property should go up. They shouldn't go up on the house next door that hasn't done this subdivision into a multifamily house.
Yeah, and so that you do see towns treating the ADU units that way. So for example, Greenwich keeps a track of their ADUs and they treat them differently. I'm sure Westport does the same in terms of taxes. But going back to your point, I think we hear when we actually haven't heard a lot of pushback on ADUs. It's one of our more popular proposals, but when you look at where ADUs are allowed, and Westport is a great example because it actually does allow ADUs, again, even because I think your neighborhood was in that mix, it does allow property owners to create them with pretty much the rules that we're suggesting. But it hasn't resulted in a ton of negative impacts, in part probably because of the spacing of the
1 acre lots. 1 acre lots, totally different.
So you do see, and I think Georgetown is an example, another example of a place which has, I think my house there was a 0.08 acre lot. So right. I really moved up here with my 0.1 acre lot. And so when you have these smaller areas, you still have smaller lots. You may see more challenges to that. On the other hand, almost every house on my street had an accessory dwelling unit or a way to create one. And,
they were not legal. They were not legal. No way. I was very active in the zoning committee in Georgetown. They weren't legal.
Some of them weren't. And so, this what we're proposing, again, is consistent with the things that even wealthy towns and nice, wonderful towns like Westport do. And it's also consistent with what we're seeing across the country. And it's a pathway to legalization for those that bring themselves up to building code. And we think actually that this legislation will help prevent the kind of dangerous situations that you're seeing, because again, it will provide a pathway to legalization as long as property owners upgrade them so that they no longer have to live in the shadows. Because as you know, property owners they do this and you don't do it legally. So
and of course, you can say to me, Ed, don't you personally have an accessory dwelling unit? And I do. I do in my property now, but it's a separate building, as you were saying. It's down the way. One thing, I don't know how you feel about this. In Fairfield, when a rental unit changes hands, the building inspector comes in and inspects the property every single time a new tenant moves in. Westport doesn't do that. I think it's a good idea. I think that should be somehow, written into whatever is done, if that's possible, because the Fairfield inspector comes in and says, where is your smoke alarm? How do you get out if there's a fire? And in Westport, doesn't happen. Nobody cares. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead. Somebody else should talk. I'm sorry.
So there was another question in the chat, Sarah, about historic preservation in the tax credit approach. Is that still a valid way to serve our purposes, or is it time for a softer organic approach to the repurposing and reutilization?
So is the question about my comment on historic tax credit, the historic home tax credit? And I know some folks from SHPO are on this call and they can speak, but more to the particulars of that program. Or is it about something else? Maybe I'm missing a dot connection.
Go ahead, Charlie. That was a follow-up question from Charlie, and you're muted. Charlie, you're muted.
Wonderful. Sorry. This is a wonderful discussion. And one thing that you said, Sarah, that struck me was, and I've always viewed this as a barrier to entry for repurposing our historic fabric in an organic way for reuse, okay? There's a big difference between the tax credit bar and standards for repurposing, essentially restoration, okay? And what we would really like to have happen, or this is my radical thought. So having stepped back and thought and talked a bit with Jim Lindbergh and listening to the Main Street people, it strikes me that there's complete relevance to organic historic preservation, which relates to reuse of those upper stories with some flexibility in terms of code requirements, whether they're in a historic tax credit district or a historic district or not, is almost irrelevant to my point of mind in terms of Desegregate Connecticut, creating usable housing stock, creating entry housing stock, creating it in the most carbon footprint neutral way, which is reusing those spaces above the Main Street. And as to Ed, I think Ed, the big concern that I see that you have really relates to the envelope of enforcement that goes around, and certainly inspections or, complying with the rules. That's another question. That's just, I just throwing that out for discussion. I seem to be hearing you say that, Sarah, though.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And when we talk about the Main Street proposals, we're not saying it has to be standalone housing. It could be mixed use housing. It could be, we've actually included in there live work studios. Many of our historic districts have been revived by artist housing, and we don't have hundreds and thousands of artists, but we could create those kinds of environments too. Or what we're saying is we're enabling towns to create those kinds of options if to satisfy the middle housing requirement. But I think it's absolutely right, and they don't have to be designated historic. Even the village districts, which are not all historic, strictly historic designated. You see a lot of really great innovations in those communities too.
Thank you. We're at 1 o'clock. I think we'll take one more question. Todd's had his hand raised. Go ahead, Todd.
I just wanted to mention, Norwalk, strangely enough, has done quite a few of the things that you're mentioning. But there is an unintended consequence. Because what's happening is the developers are stepping in, especially in the TOD areas, that the developers are stepping in and building monster buildings. Some buildings are being rehabbed, but we're seeing monster buildings built, and even outside the TOD. And what happens is that you lose undesignated historic buildings, many of which were affordable housing, not subsidized, so they're not on anybody's radar, but
Yeah.
they're not they're affordable housing, and we're losing a lot of that to these mega developments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to the need to look at how historic districting and how village Norwalk could use village districts, could
Use
help.
a lot of stuff, no question. But I mean, these are totally undesignated. They're just out there.
So, but my point is that that Norwalk, and I know they're doing it. Lisa has reached out to me, and we talked to Representative Thomas. They've reached out to talk about what they're doing right now, which is zoning reform. What it seems like they enabled the use, but they didn't actually sort of activate that form-based component of the zoning code, which they probably should have. I've told them repeatedly, just take the pages from Hartford and stick them into the Norwalk book, because you can just, it's there, it's free, use it. We did it. And the building types are not so different. And you can take those and you can take the scale, but that's not a problem with I mean, our proposals would still enable Norwalk to either neglect its, not responsibility, but neglect the form aspect of zoning, or regulate for form, but that's Norwalk's choice. They've made the choice not to regulate, and so they've gotten this result.
Right.
But we're not saying you have to allow 80 unit buildings, 100 unit buildings. We're saying 4 unit buildings, and any one of those historic buildings that has been torn down could accommodate a 4 unit building.
Yeah, but they're not even thinking about that. It's all about, monster developments, and I'd be happy to buy you, Alicia, zoning director of here at any time.
Yeah, so we'll work on that. I'll work on that with you. Hopefully, if I ever get down to my life again.
Well, I mean, I know I've had conversations as soon as he was hired with Steve Plepin, the director of planning and zoning, about form-based codes.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't understand them well enough to actually implement anything. And I think he made an attempt, but I don't know how far it got. But this would be a great way to move it forward, because there's just some bad stuff going on.
Well, thank you. And, sign up for our website, feel free to peruse it. There's a lot of resources there. There's a lot of things to take in, but Jane, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And it's always a pleasure to talk amongst fellow
fantastic. And I know people may have questions after. Feel free to send them to me. You can, like Sara said, on their website, you can get more information there and contact them directly. But this is an ongoing conversation, and thank you all for joining in, and we'll chat again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.